been standing on holy ground. On holy ground.
And there's more ground to take. Who would have thought, after a year of Base Church, here we would be, a year after our first Vision Sunday, already in our second Vision Sunday. I look back on this past year and it's nothing short of miraculous. When I think of where we were a year ago, many of us not even really knowing one another from the different locations that came together to make Base Church, I look back on a year full of God's favor and His faithfulness. I look back on a year full of a church becoming one, unified as a family. I look back on events like Father's Day, held just behind me in the field beyond this parking lot, where there was Congo lines and people shouting, helium balloons that flew for miles because the wind was blowing so hard. I think about all the team nights and all the worship nights. I think about Base Conference and our fall kickoff. I think about the Christmas production held just to my right. I think about all of the moments that we shared where at the beginning of the year it felt like we were family but distant cousins, and now it feels like we're family but we're actually brothers and sisters in the faith. I look back on this year and I can only be filled with gratitude for what God has done. We've always been standing on holy ground. That was the theme of year one. That was the vision that God had given us for year one of Base Church. And in order to understand where this whole idea came from, we actually have to go back a little bit. Last year we focused on Moses standing on holy ground. He was there by the burning bush, and by the burning bush he heard the words of God to go and set the Israelites free. But the Israelites needed to be set free because they had found themselves in Egypt. And how did they get there? Well, Israelites had found themselves in Egypt because God knew when He told Abraham that He was going to choose him and his descendants to be a people of God, that they were going to end up in Egypt under the most powerful reign during the day. We read in Genesis chapter 15, where God meets Abraham, who is Moses' forefather. In Genesis chapter 15, verse 12, it says that as the sun was setting, Abram, before he was named Abraham, fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. Then the Lord spoke to him, "Know for a certain time that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and that they will be enslaved and mistreated there. But I will punish the nation they will serve as slaves, and afterward they will come out with great possessions." This whole word from God that the nation of Israel would go into captivity in Egypt followed Abram being told that he would actually be sent out, that he was to leave his father and his mother's house and to go to a land flowing with milk and honey. This dream that had been placed on Abram's life would consume his entire being. This idea that him and his descendants, who he did not yet have, would be venturing into a land full of milk and honey was everything that would consume this man and the rest of his genealogy until the coming of Christ. Why? Because he had a promise from God and a reassurance that God would do it. Abram is then told that, hey, before this happens, your descendants will go into captivity and they will be there for 400 years. What an interesting way to start this year's Vision Sunday. What an interesting way to back up from this is holy ground, from Moses' words all the way back to Abraham, who set Moses ultimately on the journey he found himself in. But isn't this the journey that all of us find ourselves in here at Base Church? That God has spoken words to men and women long before we ever got to this place, and here we find ourselves in a peculiar situation. I think about the many words that God spoke to the people that came long before the city and university district locations of Base Church. I think of WPA that sent out a couple named Brandon and Melissa Mallow to go start a student ministry called The Embassy that would eventually become a ministry that myself and Emma would take on and then transition into a church called Slate Church, which would become one half of Base Church. I think of those early moments when God reassured us in the transition from Embassy to Slate that everything was going to be okay, even though everybody was telling us that you can't build a church on young adults. I remember those moments where God said, don't worry about that, go ahead. I remember the moments where we gathered a launch team of 35 people in our basement that could barely fit 10. And we'd have them down there. And I remember the words that God would speak to us in that basement. We would venture to different churches in Ontario to learn about what it looked like to be a healthy church. And I remember the words that God would speak to us to continue in the direction that God would take us. I remember those early words that God would speak to us at Slate Church that would give us reminders that a mobile church was not the end, but God would provide us a home, a land flowing with milk and honey. I think about the cross-section of the story of Slate Church and Koinonia, the other half of Base Church, now Base Bloomingdale, where we both found ourselves in the basement of a hotel where our journeys would begin together. Inn of Waterloo, where Slate would find itself there in its first year, opening up its very first morning service. But I think about Bloomingdale's story as well with Koinonia and Steve and Beth Fleming, where they would hear the words of God to plant a church in KW, finding themselves also in the basement of Inn of Waterloo, where it was from that place that they would meet and gather in a room called the Bloomingdale Room. And would it only be a short time later that they'd find an old schoolhouse on the corner of Sawmill and Charles Street, where this would now become the destination and the home for years for Koinonia. A word spoken from God that they were to head into a land flowing with milk and honey. I could just imagine the times when Steve and Beth proclaimed boldly that God didn't want them to just meet in a schoolhouse, but it was time to build. I've heard stories of how the Impact Center was built, and then for a period of time, people would meet there. But then one Sunday that is seared in the minds of people that know Koinonia's history, where Steve would lead the church out of the Impact Center and put a shovel into the ground, the same ground I'm standing on right now, proclaiming that there was still ground to take, a land flowing with milk and honey. A new auditorium would be built to house hundreds of people that would come to hear the good news of Jesus Christ. And that wouldn't be enough, because a school, Koinonia Christian Academy, would be put on the same hearts of the same men and women that had been used to build the church up until this point. Renovations and new builds would begin, and a parking lot would be established, where for the last 35 years, almost 40, on this property, people have been worshiping God. Slate would have its own story of moving from Inn of Waterloo to movie theaters, where we'd be thrown around in the midst of the pandemic and told that we couldn't meet anywhere, after calling every venue in the city, including some churches, and the only one left over was Landmark Cinemas. After Landmark decided to renovate their auditorium, it was time to move again. And we found ourselves in Galaxy Cinemas, where we prayed, God, give us a building. Wouldn't you know it, Emmanuel Bible College's president would give us a call, and that fateful conversation would end up with the purchase of the property at 100 Fergus, which would become our city center location. A time to move again. A time to move towards a land flowing with milk and honey. I can just imagine the moments where Brian and Rebecca Ferguson, now pastors of Koinonia Church, hit the same pandemic that we did as Slate Church, telling their congregation it's time to move online because we're no longer able to gather together. It's time to move again. You know, I stand here a year after our first Vision Sunday talking about holy ground, and I can't help but get this feeling, this resonance in my soul, that the holy ground we've been meeting on, and the holy ground that God has been using over the past year, the holy ground that now has a name over it called Base Church, that is trying to faithfully steward this for the next generation, I can't help but hear from God that it's time to take more ground. It's time to take more ground. A land flowing with milk and honey. Abraham would hear these words, but then he would hear the words that they'd find themselves in captivity. And I can only imagine how much this troubled Abraham. I think that's why it says that a terrible darkness came over him. I think that's why he needed to be asleep. I think that's why God had to speak to him in the form of darkness, because this would not be a period of time that the descendants of Abraham would particularly enjoy. God would accomplish this promise that they'd go into captivity through a man named Joseph. Joseph, the loudest out of his 12 brothers, would reveal a dream that God put on his heart, a dream that would propel them into Egypt, a dream that would put Joseph in charge of the entirety of Egypt during a famine, where his brothers that would sell him into slavery would need his help and eventually move to Egypt to be closer to the one that was ruling the world at that point under Pharaoh. And we read all throughout the story of Joseph, where it ends his whole family up in Egypt, that while it was a moment celebrated with what God was doing in the family of Joseph and Jacob's descendants at that time, that there would come a point where Pharaoh would actually become intimidated by Jacob and his descendants, and he would send them into slavery. This is where Moses comes onto the scene. This is where Moses is born into a world where Pharaoh is so disturbed by the growth of the Israelites that he commands that every baby that is born, every male baby that is born, that is to be put to death. This same Moses that is put into a basket and raised in Pharaoh's household is then one day confronted with the evils of the world that he's living in. Overcome by the injustice of his people as an adult, he kills a fellow Egyptian, and to the dismay of what he was experiencing, he's not accepted by his fellow Israelites. He's rejected and driven to a place called Midian. And it is in this place God meets him in a burning bush and tells Moses, "You are standing on holy ground. But just because you're standing on holy ground doesn't mean I just want you to stay here. It's time to move towards the land of milk and honey." After 400 years of captivity, the Israelites were ready to be released. The Israelites were ready to move on from that place. The Israelites were crying out to God. Often, as it reminded us last year, God's call will come at the cry of somebody else. And God will answer the cry of somebody else with the call he places on your heart, and he'll send you out to those places. Moses is driven back to Egypt, where he is confronted with the one he left, Pharaoh, the Pharaoh in which he grew up in his very household. And as he stands before Pharaoh, he tells them, "Let my people go." On behalf of God, these words ring out. Let my people go. Due to the hardness of Pharaoh's heart, what would transpire after this time is Pharaoh would essentially fake letting them go. He would release Israel, but then have second thoughts, because plagues would come one after another. After Pharaoh's disobedience, God would send another plague and another plague and another plague. And we read this story over the course of 13 chapters at the beginning of Exodus. And when we read these chapters, we almost feel like God has it out for Egypt, or God has something to prove. And in many ways, he does have something to prove. Because what God is trying to prove to the Israelites is that while Egypt might be the most powerful nation on earth at the time, that God is able to topple any government, any power, any voice that does not submit to his own. Pharaoh is the most powerful king to ever exist. And the Egyptians believe that it is because of their gods that they actually find themselves in power. Each of the plagues that God sends against the Egyptians will prove to the Egyptians that each one of the gods that they trust in cannot in fact be trusted in, for there is only one true God. God is challenging the Egyptian pantheon in these chapters leading up to chapter 14, where we will find ourselves today. For instance, we look at the Nile River and the plague where the river was turned into blood. This plague challenged Hapi, the god of the Nile, and Osiris, who's associated with the river's life-giving properties. God's turning the Nile to blood demonstrated his control over this supposed domain. We look at the plague of the frogs. The plague of the frogs was a direct challenge to Hagit, the goddess of fertility, often depicted as a frog. And instead of bringing blessings, the frogs actually became a curse to the Egyptians. We see that the plague of darkness targeted the god Ra. Ra was the sun god, one of the most important deities in all of Egypt at the time. He was one of the most important deities of the entire Egyptian pantheon. God's ability to plunge Egypt into darkness showed his power over Ra. We look at the plague of the livestock. And the death of the livestock was a blow to deities like Hathor, often depicted as a cow. And Apis, the bull god, associated with fertility and strength. And God wipes them all out off of Egypt, right after Joseph had provided all of that fertileness to the land of Egypt just a number of centuries before. And finally, we find ourselves at the death of the firstborn. This was the final plague that God would use to demonstrate God's ultimate authority over life and death, surpassing any power, including the power of the Egyptian Pharaoh or the gods who claimed to have power in this land. Pharaoh himself was considered a god, and so this was a direct attack against his own lineage. This is the way that God led his people out of Egypt. This is the place where Pharaoh finally released the Israelites to leave Egypt and go towards a land flowing with milk and honey. You know, it's interesting, but after all that God did through Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, the things that the Israelites had to face under 430 years of captivity, the plagues that God would send against Egypt, it's interesting to me that we find ourselves in Exodus chapter 13, in verse 17. It says that when Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them on the road through the Philistine country, though that was shorter. Why? For God said if they face war, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. So God led the people around the desert road towards the Red Sea. The Israelites went up out of Egypt ready for battle. It's interesting because all of a sudden Pharaoh has a change of heart. And he says to his army officials, he says, saddle up the best chariots that we have. And he takes 600 chariots with him. This is a signpost for us to understand that the enemy of God is using everything they can, not just their whole army, but the best of their army to be able to come down and chase down the people of God. The people of God, the Israelites at this time, are camped out at a place called Pi Hahiroth. And at Pi Hahiroth, what we see is that the Israelites are sitting there and they're celebrating this victory of all that God has done. In fact, we read in chapter 14, verse 8, that the Lord, after hardening the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, he pursued the Israelites. But it describes the Israelites in this place that they were marching out boldly. But then we get some more information. It says the Egyptians, all of Pharaoh's horses and chariots, his horsemen and troops, pursued the Israelites and overtook them as they camped by the sea near Pi Hahiroth, opposite Baal Zephon. As Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching after them. What we read just a few verses earlier is that the Israelites were marching boldly. Now we read in verse 10 that the Israelites were terrified and cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, was it that because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians rather than to die in the desert. Here we have it, the Israelites hemmed in on every side, the Red Sea on one side and Pharaoh's army on the other, and they're being squeezed out, and all they have is this terrified look in their eyes. They have this doubt that fills their heart. They have this sense about them, but what if God doesn't move in this time, in this place, in this moment we find ourselves in? Today, for Vision Sunday 2025, I feel like God has brought us a word saying, you are currently standing on holy ground, and it's time to take more ground. That very phrase and the things that are about to come might strike a similar doubt in the minds and the souls of everybody listening today. We're caught between the reality of God doing great things behind us, great things in our past, great things on this property, great things in this parking lot, great things in that field, great things in the auditorium, great things in KCA, great things in the Impact Center, great things in Maxwell's concerts and events, great things in City Center, great things in the theaters and the Inn of Waterloos and all the places that we have found ourselves collectively as a church. And yet we find ourselves between two moments. The things that God has done, that we sometimes pray, do it again, and the things that God wants to do, a land flowing with milk and honey. Not just doing the things that he's always done, but God doing a new thing. And as you hear these words, you might be thinking, can he really do it again? Is it possible to build what we've seen built in the past? Is it possible to take more ground? Is it possible to hear more vision? Are the best days actually behind us? And similar to the Israelites, in a vulnerable moment, they cry out terrified, for they're not sure what the next leg of their journey will actually look like. All right, we're here with a bunch of friends, church family, base church, and we all come from a variety of different places to find ourselves here today. All throughout the human history, God has been telling his people certain things are going to happen, or this is the direction I want you to run. And I think the initial reaction to some of that vision is kind of like, interesting. And it takes us some time to work through that. So I just love, and you don't have to go in any particular order, but just to share some of those moments, the things you had to early wrestle through.
We started church, well, in a farmhouse living room, but quickly evolved from there to renting space at the Waterloo Inn. Incidentally, one of the rooms that we rented on a weekly basis was called the Bloomingdale room. But what was most inconvenient was loading that van. That took some abuse. That van was terribly unreliable. We needed a 40-foot chain because that van needed to make it to church. We couldn't just send it to the garage. We needed to drag it to the Waterloo Inn to get all our stuff so we could have church. Anyway, where I'm going with this is a big thing that was super overwhelming was buying this Bloomingdale schoolhouse because it was an astronomical price. That was an overwhelming thing that only God could have, helped us with. It was super, super too big for everybody.
Yeah.
Well, we quickly outgrew the Impact Center. So then my husband was on council at the time with Darren, and he came home and told us about this vision to build this new building. And I think it was like $4 million or something like that. And I just remember going, what? And it was the new building in the foyer, and it was interesting to go from, how can we do this?
Yes.
To, it's not big enough anymore.
Okay.
When Brandon and Emma took over the embassy, he turned to us and said, all right, we're changing everything. I think this is post me giving you the document in the beer store parking lot saying, I'm going to be here for the next 6 months and then I'm leaving. Yes. Because you hadn't shared your vision yet. And I think that vision was the beginning of my shift of maybe I do want to stay at the embassy again. I think the next major pivot was moving out of the turret and finding Maxwell's. And you randomly showed up into one of our leadership meetings and said, I found a better space. I'm like, what? It's like, we're gonna move. And then you're like, guys, or everyone, we got a new vision. We're shutting down. We're starting something new. We're all kind of like, okay.
Hearing that vision from you and Pastor Emma, we're shutting down this thing that is, we're feeling called to shut down this thing that is thriving.
Yeah.
It's like, are we sure we want to do that? I think that was probably the one of the biggest initial kind of vision that took me back a little bit.
And you showed up on the first Sunday of Sunday morning.
It's an interesting story. Like we lived pretty close to the university when I was in school, and we actually got a door hanger. Was it even you? Maybe. Anyway,
Could have been.
Someone put a door hanger.
I'll take
on
credit
us.
for it.
Peter put a door hanger on it. Anyway, so then comes the new year. I'm like, well, let's find a new church now. Like we need to really put down some roots. So we look up online. It's like it's the very first Sunday morning service. Like, oh, it's awesome. So we go and we check it out, and we're like dropping our kids off in this closet behind some curtains. This is the craziest thing. What's going on here? I think it was Luke maybe speaking that day, and one of the first things he talked about was like, this is going to be an intergenerational church. It was those words that really stuck with Jen and I, that like this is where we need to be, that really stuck with us this whole time. Yeah.
For me, the big one was actually the Vision Sunday of 2018.
Okay.
When you said, and we're going to launch a new location. We are four months in to Slate Church, and you said at the pulpit, or no, you said in one of our meetings probably, we're going to launch a new location, and we don't know where yet, but we're going to launch. And then I, as the planner in me, I'm sitting there being like,
This isn't the Toyota way.
This isn't the Toyota way. Looking at it from the front end, it's like, logistically, how are we going to do this? Like how? Like we don't have a venue. We don't who's running this thing? Like who's going to coordinate it? Like the other side of that vision was no one knew, but it was that one step after the other. Then and then stepping in for my family, we stepped in to kind of help carry that load, and God used it in remarkable ways.
I just have this picture of our city center, and we had just taken on the building. It was before all the renos of city center, and I just remember being in what was the library, which now we meet as our sanctuary, but it was like the library. And I remember looking around, being like, how on earth is this going to be a sanctuary? And now it's this beautiful facility where people are encountering God each week. But I also remember that we took time as families and parents to actually just walk the halls of what was the building at that time. And we were praying specifically for the future generations that would walk out their faith journeys in that building. And just feeling this profound sense of just faith rising up of my children are going to experience God here. And now they do each Sunday. Yeah. But in what looked how is this going to come together?
Right.
But it's just amazing how God can do it.
I heard that there were stories where Pastor Steve couldn't even say what was on his heart for a period of time until he knew. And that's how I felt with a couple of things I've just stored in my heart for 2 years now. And just in talking to so many others, it's now's the time to just go, here's our next step. It's in this same place of doubt that the Israelites find themselves in that God begins to speak to the Israelites through Moses. And I'd like to say Moses is a fearless leader, but he needs to be reminded by God himself in just a moment. But in verse 13, Moses answered the people, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." Then God speaks to Moses. And up until this point, you may have thought the theme for this year is to take more ground. That's part of the vision. But the words that we feel God is saying to us are as follows. "Why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move on." What we feel God's saying to us this year, church, is this same thing. It's time to move. When scholars look at this passage, they said that there's a couple of words leading into this, that it can be summarized as shut up and move on. Sometimes we need to shut up those things in ourselves that say, can God really do it again? Is the vision too big? Is there too much? Are we biting off too much? Are we trying to do too much? Is there too much going on? And what God says to us today is it's time to move. fall 2024, I went on a camping trip, and we thought it would be warm enough, but it turned out to be the coldest, wettest night I've ever backcountry camped in my life. And so we're on this camping trip, everything's going terribly. I have the keto flu, and I just remember being like, I don't want to be here. But I'm sitting at this breakfast trying to muster up as much warmth as I can. And finally I realized, like, we got to get out of this camp. And I say, you know, it's time to move again. And Nick says, that'll preach. And I thought, no, Nick, that's it. Actually, I'm gonna call Nick. Nick, how's it going?
Yeah, I'm great. How are you doing?
Good. So we're just talking about our camping trip, and I've kind of filled everybody in on how bad it was getting to that camp. But do you remember the moment when kind of this year's vision statement came out of my mouth?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it was snowing. It was like Christmas morning. It was beautiful. But
that's your experience.
Yeah, it was. I was feeling great. We woke up, we cooked breakfast. We had our little kitchen side up beside this like big old log, and me and you were sitting in our chairs, like, you know, I think I was eating oatmeal, and you had cooked up a bunch of bacon ends and scrambled eggs, just like, and it was a hilarious image because you had your puffer on and like 100 layers, and your hood was up, and you were just huddled, holding this pan of scrambled eggs. And I got up to move around, and you just like sat there with your coffee and with the eggs, just like trying to muster up the strength to pack up your tent and all the things. And I mean, the day before we were joking about how pastors will preach on anything. So you stood up and you were like, well, it's time to move again. And then from across the campsite, I was like, yo, you could preach on that. And then I kind of moved on, but I think that's where the phrase settled for you. Is that right?
Yeah, I think I remember saying, looking at you more seriously than you were probably expecting, and being like, no, actually, I think that will preach.
Yeah, you did.
It was this weird moment, like, here we are, a bunch of pastors and Peter, and like out in the middle of nowhere, God drops this word, I feel, for our church. It's funny because then we come back, and that's kind of what we've been running with behind the scenes as a staff, this phrase, it's time to move.
Yeah, the merge season felt like a lot of proper internal work that we needed to do as a team. And so I think it's not like we haven't been moving, but I think this kind of word has settled with everybody, that all that internal work, I think, has now set us up to move on the outside. So, I mean, I'm excited.
Yeah, same. Well, Nick, thanks for being there for that moment at base camp, and thanks for being there all the moments since. Love you lots.
Hey, back at you, Brandon. Love you too. Thanks, man.
All right, talk soon.
Bye.
Bye. We've seen God do incredible things. We went through the merge. We allowed everything to level out, and we became family, and things happened a little bit faster than we thought they would. But it's time to move. When we cast vision within the church, when we talk about where we believe that God's calling us and the direction that he's calling us in, it's more of this this call to action for everybody in the church. Like, hey, this is where God is likely taking us. Why don't we all begin to allow God to speak to our own souls and pick ourselves up and what we need to do to go along for the journey. And it's almost this different feel. It's not this thing that we're excited to buy. It's this thing that we have to work through and decide if we want to be a part of.
Even just thinking back to like when we would do a shovel in the ground, and those kind of things as a kid are like stakes in the ground where I remember being out on that field that Sunday after church.
Yeah.
And now I feel like I'm at the space where it's like I'm starting to experience that, like, we are the ones building.
That's right.
We are the ones that, if it's not us, who is it?
It's so interesting how like vision it seems to always like outpace the specifics of what we know. It's like we have this vision, but we don't necessarily have all of the micro steps that's going to take to get there. But it's interesting because it always seems to take more surrender, more sacrifice. But it's that like sacrifice and surrender that I've seen time and time again, and like through what everybody's sharing already, where we see God move and like bring us that step closer to that vision actually being fulfilled. If we're faithful to just be obedient in each moment, it's like you get there.
When we, when I'm going back to when we were in our 30s and 40s, and and we built and we put in and we were willing to sacrifice exactly the same thing. Everybody showed up to serve. It wasn't about ourselves. It was about the community, and it was about our children. What are our children seeing?
Yes. We're arm in arm beside each other. Everyone was doing everything. We were all pitching in. It was all hands on deck all the time for everything. And the blessings that you'd see, the things that happened was like, oh, thank you, God. You are meeting our need. How we didn't know how it would be met, but you are meeting our need. Thank you, God.
And like for a company, it's kind of opposite. Like all the work is already done. They've already developed the product. The people who are partnering with them are just the consumers. They're just buying the product.
Yeah.
But for Vision Sunday, it's a partnership. You are partnering with the church, with what God has planned for you. We are all serving towards this vision together. It's not just Brandon and Emma. It's not just you guys. It's like the whole church community that are working towards this.
I've just had this new appreciation for those that have gone before. So that's an opportunity to thank Eric and Maria and Darren and Brenda. That like, it's not just sweat equity. It's the prayer meetings. It's the taking meals to families. It's like that stuff is work.
Yes.
It's like it doesn't just happen to meet the need of someone, who's in the inner city that's, they're dealing with so much and they're just trying to raise their kids in a new country or whatever. I experienced the blessing of a lot of people giving their all for God in turn for me. And I think, my gosh, am I prepared to do that? What does it look like when we have the luxuries of a building, the luxuries of systems that are already set up and in place, and that pioneer spirit, the pioneer again is like, would I have that in me? Would I sacrifice for my kids like those people? And I just had a conversation with someone today and I said, well, one thing we won't lack at Base Church is vision. I said, thank you, God, for Pastor Brandon. I said that. And at the same time, I'm like, there is a lot going on. And it's like, okay, God, help me know if there is something that I need to pause or if there is something. But I think for the vast majority of us, we can keep pulling up our socks. As much as it's like, I wouldn't mind another night at home. It's like, it's not about me. There are people going to hell, and do I care? And I'm like, did you hear what you just said? There are people going to hell. Do you care? And I don't know if it's all hit home enough.
We've always been standing on holy ground, and there's more ground to take. Base Church, we find ourselves in the highest point we could find in the city, with the whole region behind us. Last year we set the direction that we want to be involved in education, the renewal of the church in Ontario, and building a healthy local church. If we don't build a healthy local church, as I've been telling our leadership teams and staff this whole year, then we have nothing to multiply. But as we sit here and we look out on the region that we call home, it is our priority to build as healthy of a church as possible, so that when those doubts creep in that, is this too much? Or what we're about to talk about, is that really gonna happen? That we can say, hey, we've built a healthy church, we've built in margin, and this seems like a God opportunity. Let's move into the future. Over this past year, we've seen God's faithfulness in so many different ways. And when we talk about education, we really want to be a part of sending out thousands of students, and those words are chosen very carefully, thousands of students into the marketplace where they can live out a Christian worldview in the places of business that we do life in, as well as into ministry. We want to do that, whether it's through KCA or Emmanuel Bible College. Isn't it miraculous how just before the merge that we took on this leadership of this college, where now, as we want to be a part of the renewal of the church in Ontario, we have this very real way in which we can do this, a pipeline of pastors, so to speak, that we can send out into this province, in a province that desperately needs more pastors and leaders. As we've been thinking about the schools that are under our care, a phrase continues to come to mind to bring clarity to everybody in our church about what we're trying to do. Both KCA and Emmanuel Bible College are ministries out of Base Church for the church. These are ministries that we're running out of our church, but they don't stop there. Kids from other churches and Christians from churches that don't go to Base Church are more than welcome to come to Koinonia Christian Academy. And similar to EBC, this is not just a college for our church, but it's a college for the church in Ontario. And this is why I'm really excited to share some really positive news with our church. We've decided to pour rocket fuel on Emmanuel Bible College this year. And we've decided to actually move 2 of our key leaders into leadership positions at the college so that we're more poised for the growth that we're going to see here into the future. First off, we have Ashley Weber. We're going to be moving her over as our vice president of the college. And Nathan Turner is going to be becoming our academic dean at Emmanuel Bible College. We know that this is going to set us up for all of the momentum that God is going to continue to bring into the college. Last year, we rebooted the college and we had 7 full-time students. We're so encouraged by that. But we're already on track in fall 2025 to triple that number and to see more people come into the school. We're so thrilled about what God's doing through Emmanuel Bible College, and we know that He's only getting started. You know, when it comes to education, we certainly want to prepare students for the world and for ministry, whether that's through KC or EBC. We also want to do this right here in our church. That's why we're going to double down on our base essentials this year and our discipleship resourcing for the whole church. In order to build a healthy local church, we need to be a church that is built upon God's word. The renewal of the church in Ontario. What a fascinating thing that has captivated our minds. You know, this past year, we've been doing a lot of praying about refining that language so we know exactly what we're aiming at and what exactly God is calling us to do. We know that God is calling us to be a part of renewing churches in every municipality in Ontario. And we've come to learn that there's 444 of them. But we also feel on our hearts that Base Church is specifically to plant churches in every major municipality in Ontario. That number ranges anywhere between 31 major municipalities to 51 major municipalities in Ontario. And throughout the years to come, we believe that there's a special call in our church to go out and actually plant churches in every one of those major municipalities. You know, I've been a little bit hesitant to share this news for quite some time, because when you put it out there, it's out there. But we know that in 2026, we're going to be aiming at the start of a new church plant in Guelph, Ontario. You know, it's not too far from many of our buildings, and actually Bloomingdale continues to act as this central space for the rest of our church. We went on a leadership retreat, and one of the exercises that I had everybody do there that night was to just type in where they felt like God was asking us to plant a church, if they felt like God was asking us to plant a church somewhere. Of course, as leaders and as pastors, Em and I had come into this having Guelph on our minds. But with a large majority, beyond any other name or city that ended up on the Slido that night, Guelph was the top of the list. You know, we really believe that the neighbors to our east, that this is a place where Base Church can fit into the fabric of the churches that are there. And the way that we think we might start doing this is actually through a new university district location there, We haven't decided whether we'll accompany that with a morning location yet or not, but we do know that we're going to be establishing a university district location at the University of Guelph this coming 2026. And even as I say that, I feel like I kind of want to pull it back because we know how much work that's going to be. But if we're going to be planting churches across Ontario, we have to be able to move when God asks us to move. Part of the renewal efforts in Ontario don't stop there. Through Emmanuel Bible College, we have connected with already 40 new pastors across Ontario that want to engage with the college, but also want to see what's happening in their regions renewed. We run a charity network. Many of you might not know, but we help many churches and other Christian organizations with their books. Right now, we already have another 5 organizations wondering if they can come on board with our charity network. Through BaseCon, we've already seen a number of churches sign up for this year because they saw the results and kind of what God did through BaseCon last year. And of course, we're going to continue to give to other churches in Ontario that are planted, that don't have Base Church on the door or on the wall or anywhere else, because we believe in not just Base Church doing its job, but the church in Ontario doing theirs. We're going to continue on with our Pastor in Residence program. This is something that we are committed to, raising up healthy pastors in our church to send them out to pastor churches in Ontario. You know, this year, one of the things that we're going to commit to doing is praying over all of these municipalities that we want to see God reach. It's why we're going to be assigning different municipalities to different groups and asking that we continue to pray for these. This isn't a this year initiative. This is a thing we're going to continue to do into the future. We're going to continue to pray over this land, continue to pray over this province, and believe that God is going to move. I know that Nathan Lambert, who heads up University District in Waterloo right now, has intentions to bring all of University District in praying over all of the universities in Ontario as well. What would happen if God started a ripple effect from what's happening in University District already in all of the universities across our province? We don't stop there, but we want to build a healthy local church. God has blessed us with some incredible properties. Bloomingdale, as we've already talked about, has an incredible history where there was an incredible amount of faith and a lot of resources, hard work, and a lot of energy put into building what we see out in Bloomingdale. The history at Emmanuel Bible College, which became City Center at 100 Fergus, where revival grounds were held on that same plot of land, turned into a Christian camp, and then a Bible college, and back into a worship center through Base City Center. You know, God has given us a lot of property, and we've been really trying to think, like, what is it that God wants us to do with the resources He's placed in our hands? This might be arguably the thing I'm most nervous to talk about, because this is where I believe that God is calling us to move again. I believe this is where God's calling us to move on, to continue on what He has started in our midst. You know, at City, I believe that we need to find ways to make more room. I don't know what that looks like, but we're going to start with the parking lot. By God's grace, City Hall will approve our permits and we'll be able to expand that parking lot this summer. We're believing for it this year. In Bloomingdale, you know, one of the things that I find interesting about Bloomingdale is that it's an unincorporated area of Ontario. And something about that just doesn't sound right. What we believe as staff, and we've been praying into this and as a leadership team, is that we want to put Bloomingdale on the map for everything that God is doing there. We believe that it's not far from the city. In fact, it might just be this destination or a retreat for people in the city that when they enter into the Bloomingdale property, that they actually sense God's presence and they're filled with the peace that they need for the busy lives that they live. You know, at one point, Pastor Steve Fleming had this saying, and he said, "Buy the field." And as I look at the fields around Bloomingdale, one of the things that I feel like we ought to start looking at is actually buying the field. What if we bought the field, and what would that enable us to do over the years to come? What kind of things could we do for the community on that property? How will KCA expand on this property? You know, as we plant more churches, what kind of central meeting space might we want to build on this property for all of the locations to gather under one roof every once in a while? See, we have vision for some of the things that we would like to do on that property, but it starts with first saying, what if we got some more property to start dreaming with? And this is one of those things that you might start feeling like, oh, is this too much? The biggest is yet to come. And we're just going to start setting some plot points out into the distance about what God might be doing in our church. What if there's not enough space in Bloomingdale for all that God wants to do in that location, and specifically as we gather together as a church at that central location? What if God wants to do more there? What if this is a place that potentially even Emmanuel Bible College expands to one day? What if this is a place where we have to put in more parking because of all of the things that are happening on this property? In order to dream like that, we first need to take more ground. We first need to move on again. This brings me to our last location, one that we don't own. University District, meeting out of Maxwell's on University Ave. You know, Em and I have actually been pastoring a group of students in that same location for nearly 10 years now. And over those 10 years, we have seen countless baptisms, salvations. We have seen people sent out from that place. We have seen people raised up and sent out all over the world where they're making impact in local churches all over the globe. Because when university students come from all around the world and come to the world-class institutions that we have in our city, a lot of them actually go back home. And they take what they've learned at University District and they take it with them and they spread the gospel where they find themselves. This is why Tim Keller said, if you want to reach the world, then reach the city. If you want to reach the world, then reach the universities. You know, at Maxwell's, we have seen students serve hundreds of other students. We've gone out and cleaned up after people's parties, showing them the love of God. We've sobered up students on St. Patty's Day with Timbits and water bottles. We've went around on O Week trying to allow students that have just moved to the city find a home with us before they feel disoriented from the home that they've left. We've done everything that we can to reverse the statistics that say that the most vulnerable age in a person's life where they might leave the faith is in their 20s. And we've tried to do everything we can to get them connected back to the vine or allow them to remain in the vine. And one of the things that disturbs me is that this location is mobile, it's not permanent, and we have reason to believe that it's not a location that we're always going to be able to have. And because of that reason, one of the things that is most strongly on my spirit this year coming into this Vision Sunday is it's time to buy permanent land in the mind map of university students. Now that's a mouthful. What do I mean by that? If you were to ask a university student where they do their shopping or how much of the city that they know, you realize that actually it's a pretty small barrier or border around the universities in the city, around Wilfrid Laurier, even the Conestoga, Waterloo campus, as well as University of Waterloo. They don't really leave outside of this region. In fact, with all of the, if we could call it success, that we've seen reaching out to students over the last decade, I'm often asked, what is one of the top priorities you must be pursuing when trying to reach university students? And one of the things that we say over and over again is if you want to reach university students, specifically with a Sunday service, you have to find yourself in the mind map of students. You know, I've been holding on to this dream for years, and specifically about 2 years ago, I believe that God gave me a picture of what this can look like. And over these last few months, God's been slowly drawing this out of me. In fact, there's been so many moments where I've known that this is something I need to just put before our church as a place way out in the future and say, we need to start thinking about these things now. And it's to buy a permanent property within the mind map of students and put our stake in the ground and say, we're always going to be near these students. We're always going to be a light in darkness. We're always going to be here for the place where people find themselves most vulnerable to losing their faith. And when I think about this, I think about how expensive it is to actually find ourselves in that type of real estate. But I really believe that the first thing that we ought to do is just find property. But as I've been thinking about this, God's been showing me that the vision is much larger than that. You know, I would love to see us actually build somewhat of a high rise on this property, many stories tall. Now, why does this matter? I believe that we could actually provide low-income student housing to students. This might be an income generator, but something that also blesses the students in our city. If we were to build a high-rise like this, I could imagine the first floor being a place where all these different shops are able to rent off of our space, further generating some income. We're on the second floor. We could actually house our gatherings for university students, and potentially on the floor above that, where we have office space and gathering spaces and meeting rooms for the things that would happen there. You know, I think that there's a potential, I see it in my mind, where we put our offices, our central offices for Base Church, on the top floor where we can, similar to where we are tonight, pray over the city and understand why we're doing what we're doing here in the Waterloo region at all. You know, for far too long, the story around churches as they age is that they sell off valuable property. And during my times of visiting the UK and seeing beautiful churches that are just laying dormant, it has become clear to me that now is the easiest time to ever buy property that we'll ever get. Maybe it was 20 years ago, but we didn't do it then. It's like the phrase goes, the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. And the second best time is right now, today. Let's do it. Because there's going to come a day where all these churches that have been being turned into toy stores, like in St. Jacobs or other things, and so many of these places where people sacrificed on weekends like Heart for the House that we have, giving up vacations and homes and large amounts of things, where they sacrifice for churches simply for them to be sold off to pad retirement accounts for big denominations. I'm really just tired of it. And I think it's time for the church, not just our church, but the church, to put another stake in the ground and say, we are going to be here for generations to come. And we will be here to fight for the souls of university students right here in our city. You know, the irony of a vision like this is our university location probably isn't the one that can afford to do this for us. And what it's going to take is a lot of people, including you at University District, and maybe parents and grandparents going, you know what, we believe that there needs to be a presence close to the university campuses where students can meet Jesus, either for the first time or remain in his love forever. You know, these are big and lofty things that we believe in, but we don't want to lose our heart for the hunger of God this year either. 12 nights set a new tone for our church, and we're not done with that kind of expression in our church. We believe that we're going to do some tent meetings this next year on Bloomingdale's property, where they're specifically evangelistic in nature, where we get a tent and we meet under it for maybe 3 nights. And we gather under there for 3 nights and we just pursue God and we leave that space for him. One of the things we're going to ask our church to do in developing more hunger for God is we're going to start something called Adopt a Street. And what we're going to do is we're going to have an area on our website where you can go on and select what street you like to adopt. And we're going to cover every street in prayer across the Waterloo region with people that just live near those streets. You can adopt more than one, but we're going to ask that you pray over it every single month. This next year, I'm planning on doing prayer walks around the city. Yes, you heard that right. This is a lot. This is a big Sunday for us as a church. A couple of years ago, I cycled around the city and it's 75 kilometers. And I just feel led to walk that in stages and to invite some of you along with me as we just walk around the city and continue to ask that God would move, that we would contend for revival in the city that we call home. We're going to have an increased focus this year in our church on families and youth, on parenting. And we're even going to focus a little bit more on our preaching team. I've hired a consultant to work with us, and he's actually a pastor friend. That's making him seem a little too official. And he's helping us just dial in our preaching so that every single time you hear somebody preaching the word of God in our church, that it's just done with so much intention and so much love for God's word. We're going to continue to work on the structures of our church, discipleship multiplying, and our leadership pipelines. This year, we're doing a full systems overhaul on our church so that we can be more readily poised to launch future locations. We're going to continue to expand our city impact. Many of you might not know, but this past year we actually became a location of the Waterloo Food Bank. What a beautiful thing. This year we're hoping to be able to add some more days to the month so that we can continue to serve those most in need. Whether it's our free market or student impact where we continue to serve the university students, we know that this year is going to be a year of continuing to serve this community so that, as one person said, if we disappeared overnight, that the city would actually miss us. One more thing that I'm really excited to talk about is something called base classifieds. I believe that prior to the merge, Koinonia had something called Koinojiji, or something like that, where you give away free stuff. This is like that on steroids, if I'm allowed to say that as a pastor. Base classifieds is a way that we're gonna hopefully allow a growing community that's getting larger and larger every week to actually find more spots for unique community. It's going to be a little bit like Reddit for those of you that have that concept in mind, where you're going to be able to post in a variety of different ways the different things that might be on your mind. It could be something like this. If you're looking to hire somebody at your business and you're not sure the people that are looking for jobs in our church, you could put a job posting up there. Potentially, you're into pickleball and you're looking for somebody to play pickleball on the weekend. You could post that, and any of our volunteers at Base Church could be able to start a conversation on that. Or maybe you're a cyclist like myself and you want to get ready for a big ride and you want to put that on the calendar, but you don't know who the other cyclists are in the church. Well, volunteers will all have access to base classifieds, where we'll be able to find people that can room with us if we find ourselves needing a roommate. Or maybe you're renting out space and you could find tenants right in our church. Maybe you're a business owner that's looking to hire people and you'd rather hire out of our church. Or maybe you're doing renovations and you'd love to know the contractors in our church that could be able to do the job. Base classifieds is a way to try to create that small knit community you find in a smaller church while we continue to grow larger. We're going to make sure that we limit this to only volunteers, because you open it too wide, it could get a little bit dicey. And we're going to continue to make sure that we monitor it and make sure it's a place that's actually helpful and not hurtful to our church moving forward. But this is something that I have been sitting on now for a few years, and I'm excited to tell you that we've already got the beta version ready to go. And I'm not sure how much longer it's going to take, but you can expect to see that quite soon here at Base Church. A couple more things that we're looking to start developing is a studio. Our creative team here at Base Church has put forward a proposal, and we've decided to accept it, where we are going to set up a studio where we can more readily make the content that is needed in today's day and age for our church, but also so that we can rent it out to our many friends that work on us with projects and the friends of those friends, where we can actually rent this out and actually be a benefit to the community. This is a revenue generating idea as well. So it's something that will not only benefit our church, but it's something that will also go towards continuing to maintain the facilities that we do have. Base Church, I believe in our future. Those moments where you had to make the decision. I don't know what the sacrifices of everybody around the table were. One I do know is, and I think you'd be okay with me sharing this, Ben, you gave 30%, 33% of our very first Heart for the House. We would not be a church, and a lot of us wouldn't be here with these beautiful people if you hadn't have done that. We just wouldn't have had enough to do it. And I go, like, what if that had gone the other way? And I'm just curious, based on the sacrifices that everybody has made, how did you feel on the other side of it? And how do you feel now that some of the vision of the past has been accomplished and we sit at the, quote unquote, the foot of another mountain?
Even when the conversation was, we're going to shut down Embassy, relaunch as an intergenerational church, I feel like God was just like, as long as you're open to whatever I'm calling you to do, I will let you know exactly what that looks like. And that even that first Heart for the House is like, okay, this is what you're going to give. This is the funds that maybe you had set aside and could have been great to put to a mortgage. Actually, let's put it into building my church, not building something for you. We know there's more. There's more fields to put shovels in. There's more buildings to buy. There's more people that need to be reached in our city. You look back and you see the monuments that are set up, and all the things that have happened, the incredible, all the salvations, probably innumerable salvations in this building at this point. Yeah. Like, and the number of baptisms, like people just finding Jesus, and like, there's just a huge impact there. Money doesn't matter.
Yeah, it doesn't. I don't know, when we get to our age, you don't wrestle with it anymore. You just see the value in it. Like, my husband would be retired now if it wasn't for what we felt the Lord laid on us to do. But we don't regret that, because it's not about us. And it's not about, Eric always had a statement that he made, and he was, Maria, God's not looking at what we gave. He's looking at what we've got left over.
It's not just financial sacrifice. It's not just like your after hours time. Sometimes it's like even like your priorities and how you prioritize. There's a sacrifice in that. But again, there's so much benefit and like there's so much development, personal development. There's so much spiritual development, holistic development from that sacrifice that I wouldn't change the sacrifices that I've made to get to the which brought me to this point, the relationships, the things like that.
It's not going to make sense to the world because we're not building the world's kingdom. Like, we're building God's kingdom, and that like I've had to just continue to set my eyes on that in prioritizing and making decisions and seeing where I'm going to spend my time and how I'm going to manage the finances that, you know, are God's. It's to build his kingdom. And in retrospect, you just see God be faithful on the other side of your obedience with more than you could ever imagine. And all you see in retrospect is, wow, I got to sow in and be a part of that. Not like you forget about whatever it is that you sacrificed. It's like, wow, like, no, we're building God's kingdom.
That's right. It's great.
Every single year, I'm always so shocked, like going right back to that very first one, like how on earth did like 100 students raise this much money? Like, this is bonkers. Like, when it's not an investment in like yourself, you're not going to get immediately some return on your investment. But it's things that you don't even see that are going to happen.
Sometimes it's sowing for a vision that hasn't even been said yet.
Exactly.
Like, you're like, I trust this house. I trust Brandon and Emma. I'm going to sow. I'm going to put forth, contribute to this because I know that there's going to be something coming that is going to need this money.
Exactly.
And I just had an experience this past fall where Heidi and I was at an event that I was not planning to give towards. I was there and, you know, and this opportunity came up to give to this ministry, and it was like, oh yeah, I'm doing this. Oh yeah, we have to do this. But it was significant for us out of a whim, like, okay. And lo and behold, the next 2 months of my business were the busiest I've ever been. And I didn't think that when I gave.
Yes.
But it happened. And it's like, okay, God, get rid of that mindset of what if I can't because I gave, and be like, well, what can you do?
And clarity is good, and I love clarity, but God is greater. If you pull a 0 this year because you don't have the clarity, don't worry, God's big enough
That's true.
to pull it out of somewhere else, right? Or to put that on someone else's heart.
I feel like I and my children are living in the fruitfulness of your obedience that was happening when I had no clue who you were. I wasn't even on the scene yet. And then that in turn is challenging me. Like, what fruitfulness from what amount of obedience I'm putting forth in my life right now are other people going to be able to walk in?
Then that's my prayer, is that God will continue to show his faithfulness for generations so that your kids will say, wow.
Yeah. God has really started to fill our team. Like, you know, and vision comes not just from me listening to God, but I listen to the groundswell of what's happening amongst the people that go to our church, volunteers, leaders. But thank you guys for being here today and tonight. And as one who serves God's church, I just want to say thank you so much for remaining faithful. Being here year in and year out, and just allowing God to use you in the great moments, but also the difficult moments, because we've all had to pass those same tests. So, thank you for your commitment. For some of us, this might seem like a lot. I need to remind you that each of our locations has been running for a lot longer than a year, and what we were hoping would happen through this merge has certainly happened, where we are actually better together. One location bringing 40 years of experience, another 10, and still another 7. And combined with all of that experience and momentum and faith and energy for what God is going to do in the future, I believe that the things that we're talking about, both on this Vision Sunday and leading up to Heart for the House, are things that we have a real shot at accomplishing. And I know for some of these things, you're asking how and how's it going to happen? All I know to do is to obey what God has said in my soul and what I've heard from the people that we're leading, to put it before us and say, God, we're going to be faithful in taking the next step. Over this next year, you're going to get lots of different updates. I think that right now, God is calling us to our own land of milk and honey, so to speak. You know, when I think about our own land of milk and honey, I think about the fields next to Bloomingdale and putting Bloomingdale on the map here in Ontario for a work of God. When I think of milk and honey, I think of the buying property in the mind map of students in the city and building a church to glorify God that will stand for generations to come. When I think of milk and honey, I think about schools that send out thousands into the marketplace and into ministry. When I think about milk and honey, I think about Base Church planting churches in every major municipality in Ontario into the future. Base Church, it means a firm foundation. It means a foundation that's built on Christ, but also a foundation that the city can rely on for help in its times of need. Base Church, a church that means it's a base camp where we come back to for the sustenance and the rest that we need before we go out on that next great adventure that God is calling us to. Base Church, a home base where God's people can come and feel like family. I believe that Base Church will be a place where families thrive and are equipped, where the prodigal is waited for and welcomed home, where the old are honored, renewed, and given purpose until their last breath, where marriages are strengthened, where youth receive vision for their life, where the lost are found, where the saints are encouraged and sent out, where disciples are made and multiplied, and where God is worshiped and adored. Just like Abraham, when he was given that vision to set out on the land of milk and honey. I want to tell you, church, I don't want to be the type of people that wander. I don't want to be the type of people that have a spirit of fear. I don't want us to have doubt. We need some Joshuas and Calebs that when we get up to the promised land that God has placed before us, don't see the giants and shy away. Just like Caleb said in Numbers chapter 13, verse 30. Then Caleb silenced the people before Moses and said, "We should go up and take possession of the land, for we can certainly do it." And then later, when the people hesitated once again, Joshua and Caleb spoke up again in Numbers 14, 7-9. The land we passed through and explored is exceedingly good. If the Lord is pleased with us, He will lead us into that land, a land flowing with milk and honey, and will give it to us. Only do not rebel against the Lord, and do not be afraid of the people of the land, because we will devour them. Their protection is gone, but the Lord is with us. Do not be afraid of them. Church, this nation, this province, this region we call home, is in need of a great light. And that light is Jesus. As we continue to take steps into the future, we will obey God as He says, shut up and move on. Church, I can't wait for the future. Thank you for joining us in this great old adventure.